Welcome to NodeCast Explains. Today we're talking about a story that isn't just about Canada's past. It's about a national reckoning, what that history demands of us today, and how it will define our future.
First things first, we have to get the language right. This isn't a story about a discovery. It's about a confirmation. For Indigenous communities, the truth of the children who never came home from these so-called schools, well, that truth was never lost. What was new was that the rest of Canada was finally being forced to see it.
It all really came to a head in the spring of 2021. An announcement from the Tecumseh-Secwepemc First Nation in Kamloops, British Columbia, sent a shock wave across the country, and pretty soon after, around the entire world.
215. That was the number of suspected, unmarked graves that were located using ground-penetrating radar. And that was at the site of just one former residential school. It was a number that literally stopped the nation in its tracks.
But as so many Canadians reacted with shock and with grief, Indigenous leaders and survivors kept pointing something out. They weren't surprised. This was just the horrifying physical proof of the stories and the truths their communities had been carrying for generations.
So, to really understand this moment, we have to look back at the system that created it. What exactly were these institutions?
Okay, so for over a century, there was this network of more than 130 institutions operating all across Canada. It was a state-sponsored, church-run system, and its whole purpose was to forcibly remove children from their homes, their families, and their cultures. In fact, if you look at some of the official documents from the time, they referred to these children not as students, but as inmates.
And there was zero ambiguity about the purpose. Lawmakers at the time were incredibly explicit. The goal, in their own words, was to solve the so-called Indian problem by assimilating children and basically erasing their identity.
Parents were threatened. They were coerced. They were promised their children would get an education and be cared for. But the reality was a nightmare. Instead of school, there was forced labor. Instead of safety, there was rampant abuse. And instead of nutrition, there was such severe malnutrition that disease was absolutely widespread.
This quote right here, it just reveals the calculated day-to-day cruelty. While the staff ate well, children were fed maggot-infested porridge from a place they called the mush hole. This wasn't just neglect, this was systematic dehumanization.
Let's be perfectly clear. The suffering, the deaths, the abuse, these were not unfortunate byproducts. They were features of the system itself. And in 2022, Canada's Parliament unanimously passed a motion that formally recognized what happened in these institutions for what it was, a genocide.
And this is not ancient history. The very last of these institutions closed in the late 1990s. Its devastating impact is a present-day crisis, and it's woven into the very fabric of our country.
The consequences are just stark. Today, the life expectancy for Indigenous people in Canada is roughly 15 years less than for non-Indigenous people. This is a direct measure of the intergenerational trauma, poverty, and inequality that is rooted in that residential school system. And that trauma doesn't just impact physical health. It has fractured families for generations, and it's led to a crisis in our modern child welfare system. Today, while Indigenous children make up less than 8% of the youth population in Canada, they account for over half of all children in foster care. In some provinces, like Manitoba, it's over 90%.
Just think about the implication of that quote for a second. More Indigenous children are in state care today than were in residential schools at their peak. It's exactly why many see the modern foster care system as just an extension of the same policy, and why the very first call to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was to fix this crisis.
So, in response to these confirmations, Indigenous communities across the country are now leading the incredibly painful but essential work of finding the children who never came home.
But how do you even begin a task that is so immense and so sacred? Especially when the official records are incomplete or misleading, or in many cases, were never even kept at all.
Well, the process is meticulous, it's trauma-informed, and it's led by Indigenous communities. This is not a treasure hunt. It starts with deep archival research, but the most crucial step is listening to the priceless oral history of survivors, the elders who remember where things happened. Only then is technology like ground-penetrating radar brought in to confirm what they've always known.
So with the truth emerging from the soil, the question for Canada now shifts from what happened to what are we going to do about it? What does justice demand?
You know, years before these recent confirmations, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission spent 6 years documenting the history and legacy of this system, listening to nearly 7,000 witnesses.
And in 2015, the Commission released its final report. At its heart were 94 calls to action, a clear, concrete roadmap for all levels of Canadian society to begin making amends.
But here's the challenge. That report was released in 2015. Nearly a decade later, how much progress have we actually made? Well, researchers say only 13 of those 94 calls have been fully completed. It's a pace many have described as glacial.
So the path forward is clear, because survivors and communities have laid it out for us. It means finally completing all 94 calls to action. It means properly funding the searches for the children. It means forcing churches to release all their records. And fundamentally, it means understanding the reconciliation isn't possible until the full truth is acknowledged and addressed.
The children are being found. The oral histories have been confirmed. The truth is no longer buried. So the real question is for us. What are we, as Canadians, going to do about it now?